Hello, I'm Jamal Bindon, the chairman of the Moore Board of Directors. Today we have a great presentation by a couple of folks who are going to talk about critical race theories. We're pleased to announce this event called Facts and Myths of Critical Race Theory, CRT. And we're doing this in collaboration with the College of St. Mary's, Inclusive Communities, Nebraska for the Peace, Sisters of Mercy of the Americas, Survivor Rising, and the Women's Center for Investment. This event is free and open to the public. The conversation will participate, panelists will be Chantel Mallory, who is an attorney, Dr. Jeanette Elaine Jones, who is a professor in the history department at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, and they will be the individuals who will talk mainly about this. Chantel is a chief professional development officer and general counsel at Omaha Home for Boys and is an adjunct professor at Creighton Law School. And as said, Dr. Jeanette Jones is a professor of history and ethnic studies at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. Critical race theory has been misconstrued and politicized in our state and across the nation by many people. And particularly, we've seen it here in Nebraska by our governor and other elected officials, particularly the regents. It's important to have a civil conversation about critical race theories to drill down and make sense of this framework for understanding history and our society. This event is the opportunity to bring our communities together, learn about CRT, and curiously discuss the implications of the framework. We will be discussing this from a very level of civility, and we do not want it to devolve into some kind of political or polarizing debate. We hope to learn from each other, build bridges, and grow as a community as to make this understanding better for many people. We also agree that there is structural racism throughout the Nebraska lands. Critical race theory has become a lightning rod for the ultra-right, and it has also been a tool that can help unpack the historical issues that has negatively impacted communities of color, whether it be slavery, genocide, punitive immigration laws, or forced relocations in these historical traumas that has affected many people. And of course, we know that this critical race theory is part of what has happened in terms of our health industry, particularly outcomes and well-being for many families and communities in our society. We see the concept of critical race theory has given us a framework for studying and understand this pervasive, systematic, and institutional racism that permeates most of our public and private institutions. Again, our concern is to deal with things related to our mission, which is anti-racism and race equity. We look forward to this wonderful conversation and discussion and breakout groups so that we can go forward and help deal with some of the disproportionality and issues that impact our society that is obviously impacted by historical issues dealing with racism. Join us. We've asked the panel members a couple of questions to start out. And in terms of the time, we don't have a lot, as I've said earlier. So we've asked them to share briefly what is critical race theory and what it is not. And we've also asked them, what have you done to help folks in our community or in your organizations or inner circles, however they want to put it, to better understand racial history and experience. And then as we get into the sessions, we have a couple of questions, a few questions for the participants to talk about among themselves. And again, we want to make sure that people have an opportunity to share as much as they can. And this is going to be one of those kind of events where it's going to go fast, as I said earlier, but there will be other opportunities for us to have these kind of important, critical discussions in our community and in our state. So really appreciative of everyone been participating in this. And as I said earlier, it will be out there for other folks who could not participate to be able to see what we do tonight. So really thank all of you for engaging in this important event. So I guess at that point, I think what we'd like to do is give each panel member an opportunity to kind of share what they want to share. And then we're going to open it up after that for feedback from the audience. So without much further ado, we'll start with whoever wants to start first. Dr. Jones or Chantel?
I'll defer to Dr. Jones.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Smith. Mallory, sorry. So I'm coming at critical race theory really unlike Professor Mallory. I am not a trained lawyer. So my introduction to critical race theory came in graduate school as we grappled with that literature to understand how we write about and teach, particularly American history. And so my understanding of critical race theory really rests in a group of scholars who were in law school at Columbia University in 1986. One of the scholars has been on a lot of shows, is Kimberly Crenshaw, but also Derek Bell was the professor. And they basically wanted to come up with a theory for how we understand disparities in the law. And so that is basically how critical race theory came about. It was basically thinking of ways that we could understand where US law was at that point, and what role the history of race in the United States had played in shaping the law as it evolved over, the many years since the founding of the Republic. But when I came to it as a historian, we kind of borrowed that because we were interested in what critical race theory tells us about the political category of whiteness. And to make it pretty clear, and hopefully not too long, because we can go into this forever, but when individuals came to the Americas as settler colonial powers, imperial powers, people did not identify as white. You identified as a Spaniard, you identified as a French person or a Portuguese person or an Englishman. And particularly in the 13 colonies, people identified as either Englishmen, Scotsmen, wherever they came from. That was their identity. Of course, they racialized Native Americans, eventually calling them Indians. That became the term that they used. And then when they brought Africans over, at first, if you look at any of those documents, they're referred to as Africans because they didn't refer, the slave owners and the slave traders rarely referred to them by their ethnic group or whatever political group they came from, at whatever kingdom. And so what we see over the course of the history of the colonies, which is important as we go into the history of the early republic, is that instead of people just identifying as being Irish, Scots, whatever, they start to identify as white. And white has political meaning and it has social meaning, and it becomes enshrined in the founding documents. And one of the questions is, who can be a citizen and who can't be a citizen? Who can be naturalized as a citizen of the United States and who cannot? And what I think a lot of people miss is that there were free Black people before the Revolutionary War. Are they citizens? Did those individuals who fought in the Revolutionary War on the side of the Patriots, are they citizens of the United States? Of course, the answer was no. As these documents are being written, as the law is shaping, citizenship is for white people. Voting citizenship for white males, and then originally it had a class dynamic. You had to have certain kinds of money, you had to be a head of household, etc. And what we see over the course of the history of the United States is that whiteness becomes the organizing principle for who it belongs in the United States, who is a citizen and who is not. And for those of you who are familiar with the case of the Cherokees and the Cherokee removal, and I can't remember the exact date of that case, but Native Americans became classified, it was what was called a dependent citizen nation. So they're not even citizens, right? They're wards of the United States of America. So again, it's about this white category, this legal category of whiteness and what happens and how it shapes US law, right? So that only people who are not white can be enslaved, right? No one who's not white can be enslaved. So that children follow the condition of the mother. So if the mother is enslaved, you're enslaved. If your mother is white and your father's Black, you're not enslaved, right? So it's all of these things about the category of whiteness and how the laws have privileged whiteness over hundreds of years. And so what is in 1986, how are we still grappling with that legacy? So what it is not, and this is what you hear on a lot of channels, and I'll wrap up because I know I only have 10 minutes, it is not reverse racism. In fact, it is actually teaching students that these constructs, race is a construct and whiteness was something that was invented to justify slavery, genocide and removal of indigenous people, the limiting of citizenship to free white people. And there are several cases I teach my students about: the Thin case, Inre Halajian, the Ozama case. These are all cases of different ethnic groups who wanted to be considered white so that they can enjoy citizenship rights. And so it's important for us to understand that that's what we're trying to teach students, that whiteness was something that was invented to disadvantage the non-white person. And what that meant is that we have legacies of that, not only in our legal system, but in our economics, in our politics, in our society, in terms of social groups and who has access to what. And we also know that had issues with health disparities way before we started talking about them in the 20th century. So that's what it is for us as historians. And we always remember that as we try to frame the history of this nation. So thank you.
And first off, Dr. Jones gave a very great overview and recap of kind of what is meant by it. I think it's important for us to pause and just understand that lately, especially in the last, I'd say a year and a half, a lot of these words have been politicized and very much villainized to the point that they've become a dog whistle for racists to continue to spread their beliefs and to incite their base. And so I think we need to, take a second and acknowledge that CRT was something that not very many people even had on their radar before the last year or so. And then it spun in the media in a way that has been utilized to incite fear in people. It's something that people utilize, like they do many concepts that people don't really understand, is they take something that not very many people understand and then utilize that to sow seeds of fear in people so that they can incite a base that is willing to try to perpetuate these falsehoods about what CRT is. And that is done purposely. And so I just really wanted to just kind of pause for a second and throw that out there and acknowledge that, because it seems like since the CRT discussion has come to the forefront, people who are against it feel that it's okay to indoctrinate folks to one perspective, but not any other perspective. And so, the question was, what is CRT and what is it not? And I think there are a lot of people who have opinions about what it is, but not many people have a deep understanding of what it is. Dr. Jones mentioned Kimberly Crenshaw, who also came up with a concept called intersectionality that I teach on quite a bit, about us showing up with all of our identities in play. I don't show up just as a Black woman. I show up as a Black educated woman. I show up as a Black Christian woman. No one is one single identity. Dr. Bell, I use his race and law text for my course in law school. So these are academic scholars. These are not just, people try to make it seem like this is just something that rose out of some fraction of the Black Power movement in order to oppress and guilt white folks. And it's really easy to fall into that trap because of some of the fragility that is out there when you talk about race issues. And so I like to say that it is telling the story, even if the story doesn't show America's good side. A lot of times, the victor writes history. And so, of course, if you're the victor, you're going to write the history that shows your good side. You're going to show yourself triumphant. The reason why you won these battles is because your cause was the right cause. And we all know that this country was founded on an incredible amount of harm, and that people are generally inauthentic about the horrors of racism and slavery. And so I think this is about telling the true, authentic story. It's about historical reckoning, and it's not about a lot of the politicized things that we're hearing about in the news. And I apologize for my voice. I don't know if anybody else is struggling with allergies in Nebraska, but this fall has been crazy. So I apologize. I'm a little bit challenged tonight with my voice. I think the other thing I was asked was, how do I try to educate on this within my circle or within the work that I do? I mentioned that I teach a race and law class at Creighton Law School. One of my big dreams fulfilled was to go back and teach law school. And so I'm happy to be doing that. But I also bring this up because I had so many students in my class last semester who said, this is the first time that I'm hearing about a lot of these concepts. This is the first time that I'm hearing these things that historically happened, redlining. This is the first time that I'm hearing a lot of the history of the era of Reconstruction. Everybody hears the buzzwords of Jim Crow, but a lot of those horrors, a lot of the cases, a lot of the ways that this citizenship was established in the United States and purposely, like Dr. Jones said, excluded people, has been something that has not been shared with a lot of students. And so I have people at the doctorate level who have never discussed these ideas. And it blows my mind every time someone says that to me, because we are not teaching things in a holistic manner that is very authentic. And so I like to drill down to the reason why the law is the way it is and why we have had to enact so many laws to overcome racism and other isms and phobias in this country. And it is simply because the law has been weaponized as a system against people of color. And when we start to reconcile that, and we start to tell the story about how historically laws have been written to discriminate against folks, and why there are things within the system that need to be dismantled, then we start to tell the entire story, not just the victor story. And so that's how I try to explain it and really incorporate it into helping people understand within my circle. Thank you for allowing me to speak with you all today.
Oh, thank you. And just to kind of piggyback on what Professor Mallory said, in my circle, what I do also is mainly teach. And I think this is something that we have to really grapple with, as she said, that today I was guest lecturing in a class about the New Negro movement in World War I. And a lot of students didn't know. I'm like, okay, you think these race riots started in 1919? No, there were race riots in 1866. And, you know, that that this kind of racial violence has always been part of American history, and that there had to be laws like the KKK law and all these different laws that were meant to mitigate that violence, right? Or there were laws that were passed. I mean, the amendments, the so-called Reconstruction amendments, as she referred to Reconstruction, clarify that African Americans are citizens, right? If it was not codified in the law that we were not, and particularly in the Dred Scott case, you wouldn't need a 14th Amendment, right? And so I think what's interesting is that a lot of students don't know that. And as Professor Mallory said, it's because we're not teaching it. And we should not be encountering law students and doctoral students or even advanced undergrads who have no idea about this history. And I think that we are caught up in this political game, as Professor Mallory said, that has nothing really to do with what we're trying to do in the classroom, right? We're trying to teach the truth, but it has been politicized. And I saw that someone asked in the chat, should we call it a theory? I mean, a theory is just how you approach it. It's not that the history is theory. It's how we theorize it. How do we explain it? And that's how we explain concepts as being, you know, socially constructed, and that they have a legal history that we need to understand. And so I try to do that in my classroom. When I can, I'll go to a public discussion and I'll give testimony. But really, I have been doing a lot of work. And I also did some stuff for my church, in church and in UNL and other places that I can in the Lincoln community.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.
Other reactions before we move to the audience, two things I just want to say here real quickly is, one of the things that is extremely important in these conversations, discussion, and what we do it more, is that we really need to have people have these discussions more. So part of our role is to facilitate this. And there are very few agencies, organizations that have in their mission statement anti-racism and race equity. So again, when we bring good people together in our community and in our state, we see this as a plus. And again, we may disagree, but at the end of the day, it's this kind of dialogue that we would like to have. And then the second thing is we're going to be having some other discussions, and again, we're a little bit ahead of time. I'm surprised here, but if something comes up, don't think that you got to just hold it forever, because I think we have opportunities to make contact with each other even afterwards, because people are very thirsty for the truth, and we live in a society where we talk about the marketplace of ideas. So I just throw that out to say, if you don't get your points across today, or if you feel the need to come back, we see there will be other opportunities to do this. So any other comments from either panel members before we open it up to the audience for their feedback and chat? And we've seen a couple of those things come in already, but any other things that you want to say after hearing each other talk a little bit more here?
I would just highlight your point that the discourse is the point of this. It's us talking, it's sharing ideas, it's really walking through this, hearing people's perspectives. That is how we learn, through interaction. If we all sat and spoke to folks that looked just like us, had the same exact experiences and opinions and beliefs as us, there would be no challenge to anything. And so I think this piece of it is important. I think that authenticity in history helps us with inclusivity, right? So, we can avoid making additional mistakes and additional harm when we're authentic about what we've done in the past as a country. When we own that all aspects of our history are not the prettiest, and that our good side doesn't also always need to be shown, but we also need to show some of the things that we've done in the past that we don't want to repeat in the future. I'm a Gen Xer, and I tell people all the time that I'm a Gen Xer with some millennial tendencies and some Gen Z undertones. And I believe that our future generations are counting on us to examine our beliefs and the things that we've been taught, and to be authentic with them so that they can pass on the truth as they go forward. And I think conversations like these really, really help. So thank you to everyone who was involved with bringing this discussion forward. This is where it starts.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Excuse me. Well, I'm going to go through the questions. Before I do that, one of the things we want to remind people is that we would like to make sure that in each one of the sessions after that, we'll have a little bit more feedback that's going to happen after this also. So the three questions we threw out for the each one of the well, no, sorry, I interrupt. This is what we're going to do with the chat. So sorry about that. So the chat was where we're going to have people raise a question to the panel members from the audience. So this is the time you get to ask any questions that came up or anything of the two panel members. Sorry about that.
Yes, so we did have some questions that have come up in the chat here. The first one coming from Stephanie. Would it be better to rename the challenge of the educational system? And Dr. Jones, you kind of mentioned this a little bit, but Stephanie goes on to say, is it an injustice to call it a theory when history has proven it to be factual? I think this may leave room that it is a debate. We are at a time where this is no longer debatable. So the question being, would it be better to rename the challenge of the educational system?
Well, I mean, I'm someone who, I was trained that theory is important, just like feminist theory is important. Critical race theory is important. Queer theory is important. And those are just ways that we approach things. It's not the actual facts. And so I think sometimes we get confused between the theorizing and what actually happened. I think the main thing is whether or not you've ever read anything about critical race theory, you just teach the history as it happened. And I think that's what has happened in the discussion. Teaching the history of race in America has been equated with critical race theory, and they're not the same things. Critical race theory is a way that you think about certain categories, and particularly around the law. But the actual history is what happened. And so what I call for, and Professor Mallory said this, is authentic. I'll use her word, authentic history. Whether we're telling the history of the United States, whether we're telling the history of imperialism in Africa or in Asia or in South America, whatever, you have to be authentic. And I think what is happening is any discussion of race, racism, white supremacy gets labeled critical race theory. But those discussions were happening before 1986. So we have to wrestle back our own terminology, right? And take it from those people who would misuse it to, as Professor Mallory said, sow fear and division, because that is what they're doing.
Thank you.
So I hope that answers the question. I just said, you call it history. I'm teaching history, and that's what it is. And that history, you cannot teach US history without teaching race. I had a student write, the first year I came to University of Nebraska-Lincoln, I'll put this out, suits evaluations. I took this class to take U.S. history, not minorities in U.S. history, and I'm like, what are you talking about? What do you think U.S. history is about? Like, you can't teach the history without or not. So I was happy with that. It was a criticism, but like, I'll take it.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. And kind of expanding on that, Karen is asking, how should critical race theory be included within other circles besides education?
Well, I mean, I think it starts in education and in educational settings. That's a great way to start to spread things, just like we indoctrinate everything else that we learn through educational settings. But I think in the workplace as well, in systemic work especially. Someone had mentioned something in the chat about the practice of medicine and how we don't recognize disparities in racism and things like that within the medical profession. So I think it's incumbent upon, companies to be responsible and to admit their roles in these things, and to admit how they benefit from, things being slanted in one way or another, or maybe practices in the past that have been racist but have been swept underneath the rug. There are people who benefit from that. And so I think some of that ownership needs to come from, the actual professional systems. For doctors, I know they have the AMA, the American Medical Association. For attorneys, we have the American Bar Association. Some of those larger organizations coming forward and really taking a stance that, hey, there are systemic issues within our particular profession, and those issues come into play specifically because of the way history has been taught, the way there hasn't been authenticity in how we look at race, how we categorize race, how we acknowledge that whiteness has been used and weaponized, that there is a privilege in that. All of those things can come from the leadership of different professions as well, and from corporations who have benefited from it.
Right. So Alexis has a two-part question. First, is it far-fetched to say that the political backlash against CRT is more about anti-Black politics or just anti-Blackness? And then she had the follow-up of how does capitalism play into this?
I mean, I would say that the backlash against CRT is very much rooted in anti-Blackness. And I would also say, and particularly for people who talk about the way in which people are teaching the legal system around immigration and particularly border issues, is anti-Latinx sentiment. There's a lot. But I think the initial push, because it has been associated, as Professor Mallory said, with Black Power ideology, Black Power movement, that the root of that is anti-Blackness, right? It's like, okay, who are these Black people who came up with this thing, and how are they using it to so-called brainwash our kids, which of course is not happening. But I think that is really important. And then it's used to shut down any discussion of race, whether it's targeted at Black people. So you also have, all that anti-Asian hate. And there were Asian American scholars who were saying, we do critical race theory too, right? Because that's the only way we can explain the Chinese Exclusion Act or the internment of Japanese. You can't understand that if you don't understand CRT, right? That is the theorizing of that. What made that legitimate or logical is that they were not white, right? So that is the kinds of things that we're seeing happening, that certain bodies are considered expendable in the United States. And anytime we have a discussion about it, it becomes rooted in that anti-Black, anti-Latino, Latinx, Latina, whatever, anti-Indigenous, right? The original sin, right? Of actually taking land from Indigenous people. And they also use CRT to talk about how those categories of whiteness and settler led to the stealing of their sovereignty or attempts to take away their sovereignty.
I don't think you can have this conversation without bringing the anti-Blackness aspect to the forefront of it. It does seem that any time that, Blacks, people of color, of any race, gather around a specific theory or a specific set of ideas that is rooted in authentically exposing the things that have happened systemically in the United States, that there is some type of movement that is resistant to that. And so I think that we do it a disservice if we don't acknowledge the anti-Blackness and we don't include this in a piece of being anti-racist, is authentically telling history. If we're not doing that, then we are perpetuating racism and we're not being anti-racist. And so I think it's incredibly important to acknowledge that, that anti-Blackness. As far as capitalism is concerned, that's something that I haven't thought very much about. And I think that's I don't know that I have a great answer to that one. Dr. Jones, I don't know if you do, but like I said earlier, my only thought about the capitalism stuff is that there are people who benefit from this monetarily. There is a structure of benefit in this country that has been, that has provided white privilege for a lot of folks. And I think it's deeply rooted in some of the historical harm that CRT looks to expose.
Yeah, when I was a graduate student, I read a book called Capitalism and Slavery. So for those people who are familiar with that book, right? But one of the things that, and people still debate it, but it's pretty clear that, the world trade went from a mercantilist system to what we see as capitalism, the birth of the kind of modern corporations and joint stock companies. And so a lot of that early history of capitalism is tied to the trading of human people, right? Black people, in this case, Africans. And so I see capitalism as always caught up in a lot of these systems, right? Wealth and the notion of wealth and accumulative wealth as we understand it today comes out of this period, which is really, rooted in mass slavery. And it's not just the United States. Remember, the majority of people who were enslaved in the Caribbean and in South America. We have the least amount. And also the stealing of land ownership, and taking land from indigenous people. These are the basis of capitalism, right? And that's a really important book. Whether you agree with it or not, that's not my point. But it's someone who sat down and said, you know what, let's think about how racism was tied to capitalism, and that racism was tied to slavery, and that racism was tied to dispossession of the land from indigenous people. That's a hard pill from a lot of people to swallow, right? That accumulated wealth comes off the back of people who are producing goods that can be sold globally, not just in the United States, but across the seas in different markets, right?
Thank you both. So we've got a couple questions here that are kind of the same theme, which is around how do you respond or how do you talk to people? So the first one being around, like, how do you converse with people that believe or would like to believe that these systems, legal, economic, health, education, are largely created by people that are colorblind? For example, saying most people don't care what race you are. So what's a good starting point there? And then also there's a question around, and what do you how do you respond to Black individuals who rally against CRT, or parents who are worried that their kids are learning about CRT in elementary school? What would be the best way to respond to these individuals?
Well, let me start with the last question, because I recently had this discussion right before I left Nebraska. So greetings from Buffalo. No one's teaching your child critical race theory. If you write critical race theory, they can't understand it. It's like, it's academic writing. I can't give my fourth grade year old faces at the bottom of the well. They're not going to get that. That's not what people are doing. Again, it becomes a straw man. CRT is the straw man, right? For not wanting your child to know that there are ugly truths, as Professor Mallory said, about the history of the United States. So anytime you want to say, oh, well, I don't want my students to know that Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and Pierce and all of them were slaveholders, but they signed the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Someone says that's critical race theory. No, it's not. That's just facts, right? And again, it's hard to teach a theory like that. That's like asking, you know, a 4-year-old to read, a 4th grader to read Das Kapital, or, you know, they can't read that. They can barely read. Professor Mallory also talked about Kimberly Crenshaw's article on intersectionality. That, even as an undergrad, I read that as an undergrad. It was hard. I had to read that like 3 times before our discussion, because you have to get, if I can't understand it at age 20, clearly we're not teaching that to people in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade. That's not what's happening. What is happening is they don't want reckoning with history. And then the argument is that's CRT. Oh, you teach about this person being racist, that's CRT. You teach about this, that's CRT. Not understanding it's a theory, it's not history, it's just US history is what we're teaching.
Absolutely. And I think that people need to recognize that, just like anything, when you teach the proper perspectives of history, you teach that on the level of the listener, right? So if I'm going into an elementary school and talking to students, I'm going to talk from the perspective of, you know, what was really happening with Indigenous folks and Christopher Columbus coming to this country. And I'm going to break it down. I'm not going to do the turkey dinner and the, you know, the Thanksgiving all was well, you know, story. I'm going to break it down and talk about the horrors that occurred as well. And we're not going to sugarcoat those things. I think one of the other things that would reduce some of the stigma is if people took some of the fragility and personal blame out of it. You know, nobody is asking anybody who is born in this particular, you know, era to go back and atone for every sin that was created in the founding of this country and the history of this country. We're asking for acknowledgement and authenticity about the fact that the things that happened. And, you know, there are conversations that are happening all over this country about abolishing the police, about reparations, about CRT. These are all these buzzwords right now that get people worked up. And again, you know, things that people don't necessarily understand. And then when you don't have that understanding, you have that feeling of personal blame. You have people, you know, not understanding, well, why is it not okay for me to say that I'm colorblind and I don't see color? Why do I have to acknowledge that? We're all the same. And, you know, just completely acknowledging or not acknowledging people's identities. When you have those types of things going on, it makes it a heck of a lot harder to have these conversations. But nobody is saying go in, as Dr. Jones pointed out, with a, you know, a college level theory and start teaching that to kindergartners. Like, it just, some of the things that I hear argued in the sound bites in the news media, I'm just like, who believes these things? You know, who thinks that that's what this is all about? And so I'm glad that we have an opportunity to come together and kind of talk about, you know, some of the myths as well, and throw some of those buzzwords out there in a way that is not meant to politicize or spread fear with them.
And I would add also that it, you know, reconciliation, and that's an important term, and repair are important. Whether you agree with reparations or not, that's your opinion. But there are nations that pay reparations to people that they did horrible things to. The Germans just finished paying off, I want to say 2 years ago, their reparations.
This nation has paid reparations to people
right?
that done harm to.
Remember the families, it was under a Republican president, Ronald Reagan, that they paid reparations to Issei and Nisei, families who lost their homes and their property during World War II because they were interned in camps around the country. They had to get repaired. That doesn't mean that people are blaming your son or your daughter or your neighbor, but that's the government acknowledging that they owe repair to individuals, right? And that's not the only country. There's countries all over the world who are dealing with these issues because they know what the legacies of settler colonialism, racism, slavery, imperialism have done to other peoples. And so that's the fear, I think. I think as Professor Mallory said, that it's this idea that it's a personal attack that gets people up in arms, as opposed to seeing it as we need to live in a society where we are all accountable to one another, and that we want to see ourselves as united. But you can't be united if you're claiming that something that happened to one group did not happen. And we're not just talking about something that happened 200 years ago. I mean, you know, we're talking about racial disparities in sentencing. That's happening right now. That has nothing to do with what happened way back. I mean, it's related to that. But again, so a lot of times people think that we're only talking about the past, but we're also talking about the present. Racial disparities and you know, infant mortality. When you find out that certain groups don't have access to adequate health care, that's a current problem. It has vestiges in the past, but it's still ongoing. And so when we talk about those things, we're not blaming individuals, we're talking about systems, right? And how do we have repair and reconciliation when we understand the systems? And I think, again, just to reiterate what Professor Mallory said, it's the fragility that has individuals thinking it's a personal attack. And it's not a personal attack. It's not even an attack on a whole group. It's about what we need to do as a nation to move forward.
Thank you. So I've got a couple, we've only got time for a couple more questions. There's a person that individual said, I'm still unclear, and I think it would be helpful to just answer this, but then also goes to, should we be teaching history instead of social studies? But if racial facts are not to be equated with critical race theory, then why use the term critical race theory at all?
It's not the same thing. We're not using it to talk about history. When I teach history, I don't say, hey, today we're going to teach critical race theory. I say, today we're going to talk about the history of the new Negro in World War I. Let's talk about the Selective Service Act. Let's talk about blah, blah, blah. That's not critical race theory. That's just history. Do you know what I mean? Critical race theory is a class that you take in law school, if your law school teaches it. And to use the Derek Bell text that Professor Mallory uses to talk about the law, right? And other people use that text to talk about history, but that is not what we're teaching. It's just a way to think about to theorize. And I think that's the problem, is we don't understand what it means to theorize, right? It's just like there was a theory of relativity. Well, it came from people thinking about how to explain a natural phenomenon, right? Am I making sense? And from that, we got the theory of relativity, right? So that's what the theory is. The theory is something that you're trying to use to explain something that already exists. So how do we explain these racial disparities that have persisted since the founding of the nation, and particularly in the law? And they came up with critical race theory. So the history precedes the theory, right? Same thing with Newton's theory, right? And all these other theories. Everything comes to explain something that already exists, right? So I think that's the best way to explain it.
On that note, we are right at the time where we're going to break to the audience section. I really want to thank Professor Mallory and Dr. Jones for their wonderful presentation. I know they're going to still be around, so when we do the wrap up, they hear some of the things we have to say as a group and so on. Folks, welcome back. We're really excited about this event, obviously. And so in your small group, one of the questions that we threw out for this prod is there someone in your group who can kind of maybe just briefly want to share a high point or some issue? We know that not all groups may have the time because we only have about 10 minutes or so, but is there something that you like to share with the total group about one of the discussion questions that you guys talked about that you can share with the larger group? And also keep it succinct, because again, we're conscious of, we got a number of people who would like to share. So anyone want to start?
I can start, Ajamal. This is Alexis. And in my group, I was really pleased because I feel like everyone is willing to have these conversations, and there's a desire to have these conversations. Maybe the how isn't always there, but the willingness is there.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. Next. I assume everybody was talking in their groups, right?
This is Mike, and
Okay.
in our group, I was impressed by the amount of different things that people are already involved in to start or be connected with racial conversations.
Good. Thank you. Someone else? Something that surprised you, something that resonated.
Hi, my name is Jennifer, and yes, what I really loved about our group is that the willingness to learn and knowing that not lead with fear, but lead with like inspiration and wanting to learn more. And just that willingness to keep going on this journey.
Good. Thank you. Appreciate it. Next.
I
Yeah,
can
my-
share. Oh, go ahead.
That's okay. My name is Rachel, and in my group, a lot of the conversation, we talked about books and how we learn and how we learn about history and how we learn accurate history. And also we talked about needing to believe Black people and needing to, as white people, disrupt the racism that we see. Yes.
Thank you.
My name's Nick. In my group, one of the things that we talked about was kind of around the resistance to critical race theory and why that is, and how for a lot of folks and for everyone really, it's hard to hear things that are not positive and reaffirming. And some people do better with that than others do. And how by trying to reach folks like that by emphasizing that we're talking about systems and systems that are rooted historically in inequality, that might help ease into conversations like that.
Good. Thank you. Next.
This is Karen. And my group talked a lot about how to actually move the needle and make change happen. And there was, a certain degree of hopelessness about whether that's really possible, especially in Nebraska, that's quite conservative and has a lot of opposition to curiosity and learning. However, the idea was raised of just if we can plant a seed in a couple of people's minds, especially young people, and remind people to ask the question, always ask the question, who's not at the table that needs to be there, and who is at the table who needs to leave. And so I really appreciated that.
Good. Thank you. Next. We didn't get all groups, did we?
This is Deb, and our group spent some time talking about trying to figure out how we have to change the curriculum standards, right, for all of our social studies and history classes that are being learned. And we had some lively conversation about whether or not there's any hope that the state level board in Nebraska could actually help accomplish that, or if we needed to work through local school boards to get revised curriculum pushed through. But until we start actually helping our young people understand that there are multiple perspectives on history, and that, there is not just one story, there are many stories, and that we need all of the stories have to reflect the pluralism that we have in our society, and tell the truth about things without sort of making, people's identity shouldn't be, and their self-esteem shouldn't be tied up in assuming that white people were always good in this sort of binary. We have to help our kids understand that we live in a flawed society and that we need them to make it better.
Yeah, thank you.
This is Mark. One of the things that were mentioned at the very end of our discussion was just for more information, people can go to the Afro-American bookstore at 32nd and Lake Street. And they've just got a host of books, very intelligent, easy to talk to people that work there. And another person suggested the African American classes at UNO.
Good. Next.
This is Maggie. I had a really great group, I want to say, kind of piggybacking off of one of the things that Deb Manning mentioned. One of the thoughts that we had was that, you know, it might be a little bit above the understanding for people in elementary or middle school or even high school to understand critical race theory. But when it comes to how we have some conversations in our communities about racial histories, that it might need to start with the students and the teachers of our students, of our children, and holding them accountable and asking them questions and talking to them and maybe correcting some of the things they might be hearing in school, and making sure that they're getting information that isn't just talking about people that are white, but people who are, you know, Black or Indigenous or, you know, other racial groups as well.
Thank you. Very good. Thank you. Another person.
My name is Paul, and just to follow on what was just said, we talked in my group a lot about trying to bring white people around, either despite the inertia in the systemic obstacles or on a one-to-one basis. But one thing that I tried to emphasize, I'm kind of a solitary guy. My own awakening comes primarily from having listened to the people that it happens to. And you need to listen to the Black voices. You need to listen to the POC voices and the oppressed voices in order to learn what's going on. And then you can help, you know, put a word in the ear and keep the ideas circulating and try to bring the change around.
Thank you. Very good. Thank you, Paul. Next, are we got any more? Someone has not spoken from a group? Wow. Okay. Well, I guess we've heard from everyone and we're doing pretty good on time. We're just want to say kind of like we really thank the panel members, Dr. Jones and Professor Mallory, in terms of being able to help us with framing this conversation, because again, it's not easy to do that in this political size environment. And again, some of the things that we've seen bannered in our local media as well as nationally. So we really appreciate them. We also appreciate our team and the different agencies have come together to make this happen, because I think this is a defining time for us as a community, but also as a group of folks who want to do better and push back to make sure that people get the truth of what history is all about. The other thing I just want to say, and I think is part of one, we will have an evaluation that will be provided out there for you to fill out, and we'd like you to fill out as soon as possible, like today. And if not, I think Karen is going to have it available for maybe a day or so. But we'd like to get feedback, because one of the things that we do at More is we continue these kind of events based upon what people want to do. So it isn't just us in and of ourselves, but what are some of the things that participants in our community or in our city or whatever would like to do? So that's one of the beauties of using a good evaluation, is to listen to what folks say and move forward in that direction. The other point that I think is probably key, and I know we have to continue to increase the dialogue, and we got to continue to look at the circle and challenge ourselves. And one of the things I was reminded of, and I ended up putting this in a letter to someone, is I reminded of that old Billy Preston song, "Nothing from nothing leaves nothing." If you want to be something, you got to do something in this sense. And I haven't paraphrased it correctly, but what I'm saying is we cannot change our system if we don't do anything about it. So I would like to have each and every one of us make a commitment to continue the dialogue. We can disagree, obviously, but it is that African proverb that says knowledge never bends to ignorance. And so if we're about that kind of work and making our city and our community and our state a place that other people look up to, it means that we got to do some of the heavy lifting. So I really appreciate you being here today, as well as being able to help us go forward. I think Inclusive Community has some other events that they have coming up, and I'm not sure how we're going to share that, Cammy, or how we're going to
I
do that.
just posted the links about them in the chat.
So there's some other activities to do that. And one other thing I'm going to say is some of us and more, we haven't locked some of our events in. We're looking at having a book discussion with Dr. William Thomas, who is a professor at UNL, who is a history teacher, and he wrote a book about slavery. But what's so powerful about this book, I had a chance to see him talk in Maryland with the humanities councils there, is that we like to use it for the conversation of reconciliation, reparation. But why is a white professor writing about slavery, and how does he help us navigate from a Nebraska point of view, these conversations, and particularly more from an academic point of view? But we're looking to do that. But again, that's one of those events that will bring more attention to you. And then in our evaluation, we have a section that if you want to get involved, you can be sure to share your name and contact information so that we can reach specifically out to you if there's some things that are going on in your world and in your circle of influence that we can be about as a coalition to help bring diversity to a higher level. Any other closing comments from any of my colleagues in our coalition, our panel?
I also posted some links from our partners at the WCA on some videos that connect the dots between the anti-violence movement, gender-based violence, sexual orientation-based violence, and race. So we highly recommend that you check those out. But I would love in our last few minutes here to just have our panelists, any closing thoughts on takeaways for our participants and audience today. So
we
either
have about 4 minutes or so.
I'll go first so I can give Dr. Jones the last word. First of all, I think the biggest thing is just being here tonight and participating in forums such as these, where we have the opportunity to explore the tough conversations and do that in a respectful way and do it together. And so I would say if I had anything that I would like for you to take away from it, it would be one, the inspiration to do more self-study in this area so that you can be well-versed and know what to say when these types of topics come up. And then just to bring somebody with you next time. Next time you go to a forum like this, make sure you invite one. And the more we bring along, the bigger the discussion spreads out, and it's like a ripple effect. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you for your attentiveness. I'm by no means an expert in this area or anything, but I enjoyed sharing my thoughts with you all today and also hearing what you all got a chance to discuss in your small groups.
Yeah, I want to echo the same thing that Professor Mallory said, is that you have to read for yourself. I think a lot of miscommunication is because people are not reading for themselves. They're just listening to the soundbite. So as she calls it, self-study. So one of the things I would urge you to do is if you're unfamiliar with intersectionality or you're unfamiliar with critical race theory, is just read an article that Kimberly Crenshaw wrote recently on what they were doing back in the 80s, where she kind of distills it so you don't have to read all the kind of jargony stuff. And then the other thing I would say is that when people try to use that as a kind of specter, right? Oh, CRT, I would say respectfully switch the conversation and say, I'm really not talking about CRT. What I'm interested in is how do we create repair by understanding our history? And CRT might be one person's approach, but that's not what I'm talking about. And how do we get our communities to understand how we move on that road to repair? Because I think as long as we keep ceding the terrains of the debate to the opposition, we're never going to get anywhere. And so I think that's one thing that I would urge. And I too want to thank everyone for coming out. I know that it's a beautiful night. I've been told in Nebraska, it's late. And definitely, I know that you had other things that you wanted to do tonight, but I think it says something that you wanted to spend this time with us to talk about what critical race theory is not, and to talk about how we think about reckoning with our own history. And so I also want to thank the organizing committee. Thank you so much.
Well, on that note, I really appreciate everyone's participation and stay tuned for more activities to deal with critical issues that talk about race, anti-racism, race equity, and so on. And we always end on this note, and may the force be with you.